When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart stumbled, not because I feared being exposed, but because I knew which messages he might find. The ones I should have deleted. His thumb moved with a measured patience that felt cruel, like a surgeon who has decided not to numb the wound. I reached for the phone on reflex, and he pulled back with the same reflex, eyes still on the screen, mouth tightening with every line he read. I watched his face change, not in a single dramatic moment, but in slow gradations, curiosity into confusion, confusion into hurt. It was happening in real time, the way sunlight crawls across a kitchen floor and turns the familiar into something unforgiving. He swiped again. My breath snagged. I knew exactly how far down he needed to go before he reached the part that could not be excused as harmless, the part where I had crossed a line even words could not clean. A vibration cut through the room, a new notification appeared in his hands. He froze. He did not blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old tic when nerves and shame collide. My hands were steady, but only because I locked my fingers together like someone praying for weather to pass. His breathing picked up, I could hear it from across the room, a tide coming in too fast. This was what I had feared most, not the fact of discovery but the weight of it landing on the person who had built a life with me brick by brick. Because 3 months ago, I made a decision, one small, ordinary decision that unraveled the rest, and now the thread had reached us both. If I tell you the story, you'll see that nothing about it felt like a story when it began. Before I share the secret I tried to keep safe for so long, tell me where you're watching this from, and answer me honestly, have you ever hidden something with all your strength, only to discover that hiding it changed you more than the secret itself? The morning the thread began, nothing looked unusual. The kitchen was its faithful self, the white ceramic mug with a hairline crack, the plant on the sill that needed turning, the refrigerator hum a soft machine breath. He sat across from me, reading a work email as if it were a weather report, neither good nor bad, just another forecast to carry in his pocket. We were a practiced duet of small routines, his toast, my porridge, the way we set our cups on matching cork coasters without thinking. If you'd walked in, you would have said we were fine. Sometimes I said the same to myself, a line that sounded like truth because it was neat. The thing about fine is that it can be so polished you slip on it. He looked up only once to mention a change in his schedule, something about a client dinner pushed to Thursday. I nodded and asked if he'd need the car. That was our shared language, timetables and logistics, a choreography that kept us from bumping into each other but also kept us from touching. He is not cruel. He is not careless. If anything, he is precise. He puts his keys in the same ceramic bowl by the door every night. He washes the cutting board even if it only saw fruit. He is the sort of man who will replace a light bulb the moment it flickers. In another life, I might have married him again for those reasons alone. It's just that precision is not the same as presence, and I had begun to mistake one for the other. Outside, the morning had that cool crispness that makes you pull your cardigan closer even if the sun is bright. I decided to walk to the grocer, not for anything we urgently needed, eggs, milk, bread, but because walking loosens thoughts. I cut through the narrow greenway between our building and the row of townhouses where the neighbor lives. I'd seen him before, the man 2 doors down with the russet dog, the one who nods like he's signing a miniature peace treaty each time you pass. We had never said more than hello. That day he wasn't nodding, he was running. The leash had slipped, and the dog, ears back, joy forward, was charging toward the street. I have always been better at catching what falls than at deciding what to keep. So I moved without thinking. I crouched, opened my arms just enough to guide the dog toward me, and the animal interpreted the posture as an invitation. We collided softly, paws scuffed my cardigan, breath warm against my wrist. The neighbor reached us seconds later, breathless and apologetic, his hands hovering politely while he checked the collar and leash as if inspecting a misbehaving instrument. "Thank you," he said, and it wasn't thrown off gratitude, it landed. Gratitude can be like that, a weight that feels strangely welcome. It's all right, I said, brushing dog hair from my sleeve. He smiled in that quick, startled way people do when relief outruns embarrassment. Up close, he had the look of someone who spends real time outdoors, skin with weather in it, eyes soft from squinting into light. The dog leaned into my knee as if the morning had appointed me a second owner. He laughed. I did too. It was an honest, small thing that cracked the shell of the day. He asked if he could at least carry the tote bag I'd dropped, a neighborly restitution. I refused on habit and then, hearing my own voice sound too brisk, amended, I'm going to the grocer anyway. If you're passing by, walk with me. He glanced at his watch, then at the dog, then at me. We can go up to the corner, he said. It was nothing. That's how all this started, with a nothing that turned to a hinge. We talked about small things on that walk, the city's insistence on tearing up the same street every spring, the bakery that had changed hands but kept the old sign, the dog's name, Rowan, which suited him. He told me he liked early mornings because they don't ask for performance. I filed that phrasing away. I noticed language more than I notice spaces. It's how I remember people, the sentences they hang their feelings on. At the grocer, he held the door without grandness. The bell chimed. Inside, everything smelled like citrus and wet greens. We parted in produce, met again by dairy. He reached for the same carton of eggs I did and withdrew his hand with a little nod as if I'd won. I told him to take it. He insisted we'd share the last 2 cartons by splitting a new crate. We laughed at the logistics of dividing eggs, and a part of me recognized that I was finding a problem to solve so that time would lengthen. On the way out, he thanked me again for catching Rowan, and I said it had been nothing. He looked at me with a curious slant of kindness that made the word nothing feel inaccurate. Outside the door, sunlight polished the pavement into something more forgiving. We walked the block back together, then paused at the corner where our ways fork. He said, "You live in the building with the ivy." I said yes. He said, "If you ever need the ladder I keep in the shed, it's yours." It was practical and, at the same time, an offering that had nothing to do with ivy. Back home, I found my husband exactly where I'd left him, still at the kitchen table, now deep in a spreadsheet. He glanced up, smiled like someone acknowledging a familiar painting, in gratitude, yes, but without alertness. I set the bag down and told him I'd found eggs. He said, "Good, the way you say good to the weather. There is a kind of kindness that feels like air, you need it and you can't touch it." I went to our room, closed the door gently, and stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the cardigan where Rowan's paws had left a memory of contact. I changed into a clean blouse, one with a neckline that made me stand straighter. It wasn't for anyone, I told myself. I have learned that the first person we lie to is often a version of ourselves we outgrew but still keep around for company. The day slowed into ordinary tasks. Laundry in neat stacks, emails answered, a call to reschedule a dental appointment. At noon, I took the trash out and saw the neighbor again, this time in his small front garden, kneeling among stems with the deliberateness of someone reading in a second language. He looked up, and his face went genuinely open in a way that made me conscious of how seldom my own does that anymore. "Thank you again," he said, patting Rowan's flank. "You were quick." "I used to teach children," I said, a fact from a different chapter of my life. "You get good at catching things before they break." He laughed, it sounded like a door lightly oiled. "Then I owe you more than eggs." "You owe me nothing," I said, meaning it and not meaning it. Rowan pressed his head against the picket fence as if to request a continuation of our morning treaty. I scratched behind his ear, my fingers brushing flaking paint. It left a white dust on my skin like chalk. The afternoon tilted toward rain without deciding to fall. I brewed tea and stood by the window, watching a ribbon of wind move through the ivy, the kind of small weather that tells you a storm has not forgotten the address. My husband texted to say he'd be late, a deadline had flared. I texted back a thumbs up, then added, "Do you want me to save you dinner?" He replied, "No need. Grab something for yourself." There was no offense in it, just a space I had begun to measure. I put on a coat and decided to walk again. At the corner, I saw the neighbor tossing a ball for Rowan. The dog bounded like joy had a body. The neighbor waved in a way that asked permission to make the wave a conversation. I crossed the street. We talked in the kind of quiet that neighborhoods hold for you when it's almost evening. He asked if I liked the city in spring. I said yes, because spring is what patience looks like when it finally pays off. He nodded, then said something about how routines are like scaffolding. They are meant to come down once the building stands, but sometimes we never remove them. I could have argued, but I didn't. Not because I agreed entirely, but because the sentence sat in me like a stone I'd pick up later and turn in my hand. When I got home, I placed my coat on the back of the chair instead of in the closet, a defiance so small it could be mistaken for laziness. I cooked something simple and ate it standing at the counter. The house sounded bigger with one person in it. I found myself listening for the hum of the refrigerator again, the night's first dependable sound. Before bed, I checked the lock, turned off the living room lamp, and stood in the hallway longer than necessary. I thought about the dog's weight against my knees, the neighbor's unperformed gratitude, the feeling of being seen by someone who had not been given a list of reasons to love me and had not asked for one. I am not a person who looks for trouble. I like well-made lists and schedules crisp as envelopes. But I also know the ache that comes when attention becomes a rumor you hear about your own life. In the bedroom, my husband was already asleep, face turned to the window, breathing steady. I lay down, careful not to wake him, and watched the faint streetlight make a quiet geometry on the ceiling. It felt like standing at a crosswalk when the signal is broken, cars in both directions, everyone hesitating, no true permission to move. I promised myself that the day had been harmless. I promised myself that I had mostly imagined anything more than what it was. I promised myself many things, as if I could pile them up high enough to make a wall. Somewhere between promise and denial, I fell asleep, not knowing that in the morning a dog would tug on a leash again, and I would step forward, and my life, still fine, still polished, would begin to slide. The next morning unraveled like a ribbon wound too tight, releasing in small curls instead of one dramatic spring. I woke before the alarm, lying still and measuring the distance between us in bed the way sailors test depth with a line. He slept on his side, the steady hush of his breathing untroubled by storms I hadn't named aloud. In the kitchen, I wrapped my hands around the warm kettle and tried to anchor the day to a list, emails, groceries, turning the plant on the sill, a call to my sister. Routines can be a dock, they can also be a way to avoid the sea. By 9, the sky had chosen brightness. I put on the blouse from yesterday, the one that made me hold myself differently, and a soft jacket that smelled faintly of cedar. I told myself I was dressing for errands. I was, and I wasn't. That thought tugged at me before I even saw the dog pulling at his own leash. Rowan, solid and vivid, danced in the greenway, testing the patience of his collar. The neighbor lifted a hand in greeting, the movement small and uncomplicated. I felt the tiniest click inside, like a key hesitating before finding its tooth. We walked the length of the block together without planning it. He said he was heading to the park to let Rowan run. I said I had a few minutes before I needed to be anywhere. The air held sound gently, so our footsteps seemed closer than they were. In my pocket, my phone pulsed, a reminder, and I ignored it longer than necessary. We reached the park, and he released Rowan into the open field. On a weekday morning it was almost empty, a fact that made the grass look wider. He asked if the bicycle rode better after his tune-up yesterday. I admitted I hadn't dared to try it. He smiled. Fear can be a way of respecting newness, he said lightly, and I thought about how many categories that could hold. Rowan bounded after the ball, returning with the solemn pride of a worker who loves his job. Some joy calms you simply by asking to be witnessed. We walked the perimeter path, curving enough to feel like we were going somewhere even when we were circling back. He told me he worked from home most days, liked the quiet, and that Rowan trained him to leave the desk before noon. I said I used to start my days outside but lately used weather as an excuse not to move. We traded these small confessions like marbles, bright, pocketable, adding weight you notice on stairs. A cyclist skidded on grid ahead of us and righted himself with a laugh. It gave us a small jolt and a shared relief. He glanced at me, making sure I was fine, and the courtesy felt rare. I asked Rowan's age, he asked how long we'd lived in our building. Facts arranged themselves between us like chess pieces refusing to become an argument. At the gate, I said I should go. He nodded, but neither of us moved. The pause wasn't dramatic, it was honest. I felt my pulse where the cuff pressed my wrist. Thank you again for yesterday, he said. It was nothing, I replied, though we both knew the word didn't fit. We walked back slower, as if the street had lengthened. Outside the bakery, Rowan stopped to study a step as if it held a library of scent. He asked if I liked their muffins. I said they were reliable for a small sweetness that didn't pretend to be a celebration. He laughed, and the sound opened something uncomplicated in me. We passed newspaper boxes, their headlines full of other people's crises. My own life never warranted a headline, that used to comfort me. Now the privacy felt like a room with blinds always drawn. He gestured toward my street and said he could walk me the rest of the way. I didn't want to make him late. I'm not late to anything, he said. I believed him, and maybe that was the point. A breeze lifted a curl across my cheek. I tucked it back and saw him notice. He didn't overdo it, just registered it, like noting a landmark for later. At my building's gate, I rested a hand on the cool iron as if to make the boundary clear. Boundaries can be touched, named, and set down again. He said he'd be in his yard later, fixing a hinge. I said I had errands. The script wrote itself and refused to end. In the silence that followed, the morning thickened. I realized I was holding my breath, just enough to tilt my balance. I let it go and met his gaze, ordinary in height, extraordinary in clarity. A car door slammed down the street. Rowan's tag chimed once. The world resumed. He stepped half a pace closer, not invading, not presuming, simply arriving. Decisions rarely announce themselves, they form in small muscles, in the breath before words. I should go, I said. Okay, he answered softly. The word neither asked nor forbade. My hand dropped from the gate. We each took the smallest step. We kissed. It lasted the length of a thought, carrying the weight of a declaration. When we drew back, the ordinary sounds returned, the rattle of a delivery truck, laughter 2 streets over, a sparrow deciding the wire was good enough. I heard my heart only because I was listening for it. He smiled, a grateful, startled thing. I nodded, meaning thank you and also this changes the day. I went inside, climbing the stairs slowly, aware of my own body the way you are after carrying something fragile. In the apartment, I set my keys in the ceramic bowl and stood still until the quiet rearranged itself. I checked the clock and saw I'd been gone longer than I could explain neatly. The thought didn't panic me, it just took a chair among others. I made tea I didn't drink. I wiped a clean counter twice. I sat on the bed's edge, touching the place where the pulse had argued with the cuff. I told myself what people tell themselves when the ground tilts. Nothing irreversible had happened, sunlight is indifferent, a kiss can be a boundary, not a door. The sentences sounded reasonable and fit poorly, like clothes from another decade. By noon, emails had stacked in my inbox with the patience of paper. I answered none. I stared at the bicycle, considered a short ride, a rehearsal for motion that wouldn't announce itself. I didn't go. Movement felt like a confession. Instead, I opened the window, letting mild air in, a compromise that seemed safe. I don't know why some minutes lodge in the body while hours pass like neutral weather. I only know that when my husband texted to say he'd be home early for once, the room tilted again, and I gripped the chair back as if the floor had become a boat. I typed great and added a smile I didn't feel. The kettle clicked as it cooled. In the hallway mirror, my face looked like a city map, streets built for reasons that no longer applied. I touched my cheek, as if it could tell me which route would hurt least. The day after the kiss felt oddly heavier, as if air had picked up a weight I couldn't see. Morning light pressed through the curtains in measured lines, mapping the floor like a set of quiet instructions. My husband moved through the kitchen with his usual efficiency, coffee poured, toast buttered, a glance at the news on his phone. Nothing about him suggested suspicion, but absence can be just as telling as presence. I kept my eyes on my mug, the steam rising in slow curls, and answered his small talk with even smaller replies. It was the easiest way to keep balance when my mind was elsewhere. Once he left for work, the apartment shifted into stillness. The sound of the door closing lingered longer than usual, as if it were holding its breath too. I thought about the kiss, replaying its brevity, the way it had been both nothing and not nothing. I tried to fold it into the category of moments that could be filed away, but it kept slipping into the space reserved for things that quietly changed the shape of a day. I dressed without much thought, choosing clothes that were practical enough to be dismissed but chosen enough to feel deliberate. The grocery list I had written yesterday sat on the counter. I picked it up without reading. Outside, the air was bright but not warm, a light breeze carrying the smell of cut grass from somewhere nearby. My feet took me toward the park without permission, as if they knew I wouldn't be using the direct route to the store. I saw him before he saw me, standing by the fence while Rowan sniffed through a patch of wild clover. He bent slightly, speaking to the dog in a low, unguarded tone, then straightened and noticed me. His expression didn't change much, just the smallest shift in his eyes, like someone registering a familiar song playing faintly in another room. We met halfway, exchanging the sort of greeting that belongs to people who already know the answer but ask anyway. We walked together along the path that curved toward the quieter end of the park. Rowan trotted ahead, occasionally looking back as if to confirm that this arrangement suited us all. We talked about nothing urgent, the tree trimming along Main Street, the new hours at the bakery, but under each sentence was the awareness of what had passed between us. It made the pauses longer, the silences less casual. A man with a stroller passed, and we stepped aside in unison, our shoulders brushing briefly. It wasn't enough to mean anything on its own, but it gathered meaning because of what we carried from yesterday. I found myself watching the way sunlight touched the back of his jacket, how the fabric folded when he moved. These were details I wouldn't have noticed before, or if I had, they wouldn't have stayed. At the far edge of the park, we stopped near a bench. Rowan lay down in the grass, content to rest in the shade. We both sat, leaving a polite space between us. He asked about my morning, and I kept the answer simple. I asked about his work, and he said it was steady, then mentioned a repair he needed to do on his porch railing. It was ordinary conversation, but each sentence felt like a marker placed along a path we were both mapping in real time. A gust of wind carried the faint scent of rain, though the sky was still open and pale. I watched a cluster of leaves twist above us, their shadows shifting over the ground. The quiet between us didn't demand to be filled. In fact, it felt steadier than words, as if both of us understood that any excess might tip the balance. When Rowan stirred, we rose and began walking back. Near the park gate, a cyclist rang his bell, and we stepped closer together to let him pass. The proximity sent a brief charge through me, unexpected and unspoken. We didn't comment on it, just continued on until we reached the street where our routes would normally split. He paused, one hand resting lightly on Rowan's leash. There was a question in his posture, though he didn't voice it. I told him I needed to head to the store before going home. He nodded, and for a moment we stood there like people rehearsing a parting they didn't entirely want. Then Rowan tugged forward, and he let himself be pulled along. We exchanged a small wave, the kind that acknowledges more than it admits. At the store, I moved through the aisles slowly, the list in my hand turning into a prop rather than a guide. I picked up items in no particular order, aware that I was thinking less about groceries and more about the morning's walk. Back home, I unpacked the bags methodically, each item placed in its proper place, as if restoring order to shelves might restore order elsewhere. The afternoon stretched without urgency. I tried to work on a small project I had neglected for weeks, but my concentration kept folding in on itself. I caught myself glancing toward the window more than once, scanning for no one in particular. The street was quiet, save for the occasional passing car. I told myself I was simply noticing the weather. By early evening, my husband returned. He spoke about his day in broad strokes, deadlines met, a colleague's birthday cake in the break room. I listened, nodding where it seemed right, my own day reduced to the grocery store and some half-finished tasks. He didn't press for more, and I didn't offer. We moved around each other in the kitchen, the rhythm familiar, the spaces between us unremarkable on the surface. After dinner, I washed the dishes while he read in the living room. The sound of pages turning reached me between the rush of water and the clink of porcelain. I dried my hands and stood for a moment, looking toward him without calling his name. The lamplight shaped him into something both known and slightly distant. I turned back to the sink, the cool porcelain beneath my palms grounding me in the small, unchanging act of being here. Later, in bed, I lay awake longer than I meant to. The quiet was deep enough to hear the faint hum of the refrigerator through the wall. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to see if the image of the park bench, the curved path, and the look in his eyes when he first saw me that morning would fade. It didn't. Some moments don't wait for permission to stay. The next day began with the kind of gray light that makes everything appear slightly muted, as though the world had been lowered a few shades. My husband left early for a meeting, the click of the door marking the start of my solitude. I moved through the apartment quietly, as if making too much noise might bring questions I wasn't prepared to answer. The air held that cool dampness before rain, and I felt a restlessness in my chest, the kind that refuses to be worked away by chores or lists. I decided to check the bicycle, the one he had helped repair. It leaned in the corner of the storage room, tires still holding their firmness. Running my hand over the handlebars, I thought about his precision when he worked on it, the way his attention seemed to land fully on whatever was in front of him. It was different from the split focus I had grown used to at home, where conversations were often held in the shadow of other tasks. I wheeled it out, telling myself I would ride just around the block, but my feet turned in the direction of his street. He was in his driveway, crouched over a wooden board balanced on two sawhorses. Rowan lay nearby, head on his paws, watching as he worked. The sound of a drill stopped when he noticed me, and he straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. There was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if he had already pictured me arriving at some point. He gestured toward the bicycle with a small nod, and I told him it seemed fine but I hadn't taken it far yet. He suggested a quick check, just to be sure. I stood beside him while he looked over the chain and brakes, his movements practiced. The scent of sawdust and metal mixed in the air. Rowan came over, pressing against my leg until I reached down to scratch behind his ears. It was a simple scene, the kind that could have belonged to any two neighbors, but I was acutely aware of how closely I was watching him, noticing the small lines at the edge of his eyes, the concentration in his hands. A sound interrupted us, the gate latch lifting. A woman from the next house stepped in, calling out a greeting. She was carrying a package and asked if he could sign for it, explaining she was in a hurry. He agreed, moving to the porch to take it from her, and I felt my pulse quicken in an unexpected way, a reflex I couldn't explain to anyone else. She glanced at me briefly, then left as quickly as she had arrived. The interruption was ordinary, but it pulled me out of the small cocoon of the moment, reminding me that this wasn't a space that belonged only to us. He returned to the bicycle, testing the brakes one last time. "It should be good now," he said, stepping back so I could take hold of it. I thanked him, and for a moment we simply stood there, the paws stretching in the cool air. There was nothing pressing to say, yet leaving felt abrupt. I finally wheeled the bike toward the street, aware of his gaze following me until I turned the corner. Back home, I placed the bicycle in its spot and went to the kitchen, making tea more out of habit than desire. I found myself listening for sounds that couldn't possibly carry this far: the scrape of a tool, Rowan's bark, only to be met by the still hum of the refrigerator. The apartment felt larger than usual, the kind of large that makes you aware of its empty corners. I moved through each room slowly, touching small objects as if they might answer some unspoken question. The afternoon passed in fragments. I read a few pages of a book without remembering them, sorted laundry into neat piles, and watched the sky darken toward rain. At one point, I caught myself standing by the window, looking toward the direction of his house even though it was out of sight. I told myself it was just a habit of observation, the way people notice traffic patterns or the way a tree bends in the wind, but it was a thin explanation. By evening, the rain had started, tapping softly against the glass. My husband came home later than usual, damp at the shoulders from walking without an umbrella. He spoke about the meeting, the progress made, the deadlines ahead. I listened, answering where needed, my mind half present. After dinner, we sat in the living room, him reading and me folding the laundry I had left on the armchair. It was a quiet that should have been comfortable, but it felt more like a truce between two silences. When it was time for bed, I lingered in the hallway, switching off lights one by one. In the bedroom, I changed into something warm, the sound of rain steady on the window. He was already lying down, scrolling through something on his phone, the glow reflecting on his face. I slid under the covers, turning to face the other side. My eyes followed the faint lines of light from the street, tracing patterns across the ceiling until they blurred. I thought about the moment in his driveway, the sound of the drill stopping, the brief arrival of the neighbor with her package. It wasn't the interruption itself that stayed with me, but the sharp awareness of how easily the space between us could be altered by something so small. I realized then that what unsettled me most wasn't what had already happened, it was how quickly something ordinary could begin to feel necessary. The thought followed me into sleep, quiet but insistent, like the sound of rain that never let up through the night. The rain from the night before had left the morning streets washed and reflective, the kind of damp brightness that carries both freshness and the faint heaviness of lingering clouds. My husband was still asleep when I rose, his breathing even and slow. I moved quietly through the kitchen, making coffee and setting the mug down without the usual clink, as though the sound might disturb more than just his rest. The air was cool, almost crisp, and I felt the urge to step outside before the day could take its usual shape. I pulled on a jacket and headed toward the park without deciding to. The pavement was slick in patches, and the smell of wet earth rose with each step. Near the corner, I saw him, standing under the partial cover of a tree, Rowan at his side, leash slack as the dog sniffed along the edge of the grass. He turned when I approached, his expression shifting into the smallest of smiles, one that seemed to acknowledge both the chance of the meeting and the unspoken truth that it wasn't entirely chance. We walked together toward the quieter side of the park. Rowan trotted ahead, then circled back, his paws leaving faint marks on the damp path. The conversation started lightly, remarks about the rain, the way it had cleaned the air, the early signs of autumn in the leaves. Yet beneath those words was a current that pulled us steadily forward, a familiarity built on more than the sum of our exchanges. We reached a bench tucked away under a cluster of trees, their branches holding drops that occasionally fell with a soft patter. He gestured toward it, and we sat, leaving a narrow space between us that felt deliberate. From here, the park opened in a wide view, a stretch of grass darkened by rain, the pale line of the walking path, the glint of water in the puddles. For a while, we simply watched Rowan chase a drifting leaf, his movements unbothered by the damp. I mentioned the bicycle, how I had finally taken it out for a short ride yesterday afternoon. He asked if it handled well, and I admitted it felt smoother than before. There was something grounding in that exchange, the way it stayed firmly in the realm of the ordinary while carrying the memory of every moment that hadn't been. He spoke about his porch repairs, the tools he still needed to borrow, and I found myself picturing the space as he described it, wood under careful hands, the quiet rhythm of measured work. A light breeze stirred, carrying the scent of rain-soaked wood and grass. He looked at me for a moment longer than the conversation required, and I felt the weight of that pause. It wasn't intrusive, just present, like a question left between us. I looked away first, focusing on Rowan as he returned to sit at his owner's feet. We rose from the bench and began walking back along the path, the space between us narrowing slightly without either of us adjusting it consciously. The ground was soft underfoot, and the quiet of the park seemed to press closer, muffling the distant hum of traffic. When we reached the gate, we both slowed, as if stepping beyond it would dissolve the brief world we had just shared. A car passed, sending a spray from the wet road toward the curb. He shifted slightly toward me, a small instinctive movement, and our shoulders brushed. The contact was light, but it stayed with me like the trace of a warm hand. We stood there for a moment, neither speaking, the street stretching away in both directions. He glanced at Rowan, then back at me, and there was an almost imperceptible nod, an unspoken agreement that the morning didn't need explanation. I could feel the rain beginning again, the smallest drops catching in my hair, and I knew that if I turned to walk away now, the moment would close quietly. But I didn't move right away. We kissed. It was brief, no more than a joining of the space we had been circling for days, yet it carried the weight of something acknowledged rather than discovered. The sound of rain on the leaves overhead filled the silence that followed. When we stepped back, the world seemed to resume at its usual pace. A cyclist passed, Rowan shook off water, a bus rumbled in the distance. He gave the smallest smile, one that didn't reach for more than the moment allowed. I returned it, knowing it meant the same thing for both of us. I turned toward home, my steps steady but my thoughts scattered, each one catching on the edges of what had just happened. The streets felt sharper in their detail, the slick sheen on the pavement, the soft hiss of tires through puddles, the muted reflection of buildings in the water collected at the curb. By the time I reached my building, the rain had become a light drizzle, enough to cling to my jacket but not enough to hurry me inside. In the apartment, I set my keys down and went to the window, watching the street without really seeing it. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room, and it seemed to deepen the stillness rather than break it. I moved through the motions of making tea, measuring the leaves, pouring the water, letting it steep, but when I sat down with the cup, I didn't drink. My mind kept replaying the morning, not in scenes, but in small, sensory fragments, the cool air, the weight of the pause on the bench, the faint scent of sawdust from his jacket, the quiet after. The day unfolded around those fragments. I answered a few emails, folded laundry, prepared dinner. When my husband came home, the evening settled into its usual rhythm, his stories from work, my recounting of errands, the quiet space of the living room after we'd eaten. There was nothing in his expression to suggest he noticed anything different, and yet I found myself speaking less than usual, holding back without meaning to. Later, lying in bed, I listened to the rain beginning again, the steady pattern against the glass. I thought about how quickly something could shift from possibility to memory, how a moment can feel both complete and unfinished at the same time. The darkness in the room was soft, but I kept my eyes open, tracing the faint outlines of familiar shapes, knowing that sleep would take time to find me. The following morning unfolded with the sort of quiet that feels deliberate, as if the day had chosen to keep its voice low. My husband had left earlier than usual, his parting words brief and routine, leaving the apartment still in the pale half-light. I moved slowly through the rooms, not from fatigue but because there was no reason to hurry. Outside, the streets glistened faintly from another night of rain, and the air pressed cool against the windows. I tried to begin the morning as I always did, coffee, a brief scan of the headlines, a mental list of the day's tasks, but my thoughts wandered almost immediately, circling back to the bench under the trees, the sound of rain on leaves, the unhurried pause before walking away. It was strange how the smallest details had lodged themselves so firmly, the angle of his shoulders when he turned toward me, the glint of water in Rowan's fur. By mid-morning, the pull to step outside had settled in as a steady undertone, not urgent but insistent. I put on a coat, not bothering with an umbrella, and walked toward the park, telling myself I only wanted the fresh air. The path curved ahead in a way that made each corner feel like a decision. I saw him before Rowan noticed me. He was standing near the low wooden fence that bordered one side of the park, speaking quietly to an older man who seemed to be giving advice about tools. Rowan spotted me first, ears lifting, body tilting forward before the leash reminded him to wait. When the conversation ended, the man walked away, and he turned to greet me with a nod that was neither surprised nor casual, it carried the weight of recognition. We fell into step without discussion, following the gravel path along the quieter side. Rowan padded ahead, then paused to examine every patch of grass that seemed to hold a story. Our conversation stayed anchored in the safe parts of the map, the shift in the weather, a new cafe opening on the next street, his ongoing work on the porch railing. Yet each exchange had a way of holding a second layer underneath, something unspoken but present. When we reached the far end of the path, a light wind carried the scent of damp wood and earth. We stopped near a row of benches, this time not to sit but to stand and look out over the open grass. He mentioned needing a few more supplies for his repairs, and without thinking, I offered to help him carry them back if he went to get them later. The offer was practical on its surface, yet even I could hear the quiet intention in it. We began walking back toward the gate, the space between us narrowing in the natural way it does when two people match each other's pace. At the edge of the park, a group of schoolchildren passed, their voices bright and scattered, the clatter of their footsteps filling the air for a moment. After they were gone, the quiet returned more quickly than I expected, like water closing after a boat has moved through. At the corner where we would usually part, he asked if I had time for coffee. It was an easy question, but it caught on something inside me. I said yes before my hesitation could shape itself into words. We walked to the small cafe tucked between the hardware store and the bakery, a place where the tables were close together and the windows steamed on cool mornings. Inside, we chose a corner table. The room smelled of roasted beans and fresh bread, and the low hum of other conversations blurred into a kind of background curtain. We spoke about small things at first, but the pauses between our sentences lengthened in a way that didn't feel uncomfortable. I noticed the way he listened, not with the fixed attention of someone trying to prove they're listening, but with the quiet patience of someone who actually is. When we finished, we lingered a moment longer than necessary, neither of us making the first move to stand. Eventually, we stepped back into the street, the light outside sharper than when we had entered. We walked together until the block forced a choice of direction. He turned toward his street, I toward mine. We didn't say when we might see each other again, but it didn't feel like an uncertainty. Back home, I went through the familiar motions of the afternoon, sorting the mail, folding laundry, answering 2 short messages. Yet each task felt thin around the edges, as though it were being done in half measure. My mind replayed the morning in quiet loops, not searching for meaning but holding on to its shape. When my husband came home that evening, the apartment settled into its usual pattern, the exchange of brief updates, the quiet after dinner, the soft glow of lamplight in the living room. He didn't notice anything unusual in my tone or in the way I moved through the space, or if he did, he didn't mention it. Later, in bed, I lay awake long enough to hear the clock mark the hour. The room was still, the air carrying the faint scent of the rain that had passed earlier. I thought about the way the cafe windows had fogged, the way his voice had sounded when he asked if I had time, the way the path in the park curved just enough to hide the next stretch until you reached it. Some moments, I realized, are less about the choices you make in them and more about how they take root after you've walked away. The morning began with a light fog, softening the outlines of everything beyond the window. My husband left quietly, taking his travel bag with him for an overnight business trip. The sound of the zipper closing seemed to linger in the room longer than it should have. I wished him a good trip, and he kissed my cheek in that quick, absent way he always did when his mind was already halfway to the airport. When the door closed behind him, the apartment seemed to loosen, as if its walls had exhaled. I made coffee but didn't drink it right away. Instead, I stood at the counter, watching the steam rise in pale threads, feeling the stillness wrap itself around the morning. Outside, the fog was lifting, leaving the air damp and cool. It felt like a day waiting to be claimed. I dressed without much deliberation, jeans, a light sweater, the jacket I always wore for walking, and left the apartment. My feet carried me toward the park again, the route now so familiar it felt almost rehearsed. When I reached the gate, I saw him standing with Rowan, the dog's leash loose in his hand. He looked up as if he'd been expecting me. We didn't talk much as we walked. The quiet between us was comfortable, carrying its own form of recognition. Rowan trotted ahead, then fell back, weaving between us in a slow, content rhythm. The gravel path curved toward the far side of the park where the trees stood closer together, their branches still holding beads of moisture from the fog. At one point, he mentioned needing to pick something up from his house before heading into town. The suggestion hung there only briefly before he added, "You could wait inside if you'd like. It won't take long." The offer was casual in tone, but it pressed on a part of me that had been restless for days. I said yes before I'd given myself time to rehearse an excuse. His house was quiet, carrying the faint smell of sawdust and coffee. Rowan padded in and settled on a rug near the door, content to watch us move about. He stepped into another room, gathering what he needed, and I wandered a little, just enough to notice the careful order of his space, the way everything seemed chosen for use rather than display. When he returned, we stood for a moment without speaking. The light through the front window fell across the floor in narrow rectangles, and the world outside felt far away. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded filling, it was the kind that seemed to wait for a choice. We spent the night together. In the morning, the light in his house felt different, warmer, softer, carrying the quiet satisfaction of a day not yet disturbed. Rowan stretched and yawned, his claws clicking lightly against the floor as he crossed to the door. He opened it to let the dog out into the small yard, and I followed, standing just inside the frame. The grass was still wet, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke from somewhere nearby. We spoke little as we moved through the start of the day. He made coffee, and I stood at the counter watching him measure the grounds with an ease that matched the quiet. The simplicity of it felt almost disarming, two people sharing a morning without the weight of formal plans. Eventually, I said I should go. The words felt heavier than they sounded. He nodded, not pressing for more. At the door, Rowan brushed against my leg as if in farewell. I stepped outside, the cool air settling around me, and walked back toward my street. The apartment was just as I'd left it, silent, orderly, holding no trace of the hours I'd been away. I set my keys in their usual place and stood for a moment in the center of the living room, letting the stillness settle. There was no rush to fill the rest of the day, but the hours felt different now, stretched and pliable, holding more than they had before. I moved through my usual tasks, laundry, tidying the kitchen, answering a few messages, though each one seemed to carry a thin layer of distraction. My mind drifted back to the narrow rectangles of light on his floor, the sound of Rowan's claws, the ease of standing side by side without the need to speak. By late afternoon, the sky had cleared, and the sunlight poured into the apartment in bright slants. I made dinner for one, plating it without ceremony, and ate while the faint hum of traffic seeped in from the street below. When my husband called to say his meeting had gone well and he'd be home by late morning tomorrow, his voice was warm but hurried, shaped by the noise of the airport behind him. I wished him a safe trip, and we ended the call with the practiced brevity of people who had learned to save their longer words for later. That night, I lay in bed listening to the faint rhythm of the city outside, my mind drifting between the apartment's quiet and the memory of the morning's light in his house. Some changes happen all at once, like a door swinging open. Others arrive more quietly, altering the shape of the room before you've even realized it's different. The morning after his return to the airport was marked by a pale, untroubled sky, the kind that makes shadows appear softer and shorter. My husband called from his hotel, his voice carrying the faint echo of a large lobby, telling me his morning meeting had been moved forward. He would be home earlier than expected. I told him that would be nice, and we both left it at that. When the call ended, the apartment's silence seemed to resume exactly where it had paused. I made coffee and drank it by the window, watching a delivery truck idle on the street below. The driver climbed out, left the engine running, and disappeared into a doorway with a package. It was an ordinary scene, but the sound of the engine thrumming against the stillness pulled me into the present for a few moments before my mind drifted elsewhere. By mid-morning, I decided to take a walk. The air outside was clear, the pavement dry after days of damp weather. I headed toward the market, a route that passed not far from his street. I told myself it was simply the most direct way, though I noticed my pace slowing as I approached the turn that would bring his house into view. Rowan was in the yard, lying in a patch of sunlight, his head lifting when he saw me. A moment later, he appeared at the open gate, one hand resting lightly on the latch. We exchanged a simple greeting. He mentioned he was heading into town to pick up supplies and asked if I was going that way. I nodded, and we fell into step together. The walk into town was steady and unhurried. We spoke about small, safe things, the hardware store's inconsistent stock, a new bench that had been added near the park entrance, the way the light looked sharper in the autumn air. At times, we walked in silence, and it didn't feel awkward. There was a quiet understanding in our pace, as if the act of walking side by side carried its own meaning. At the hardware store, he collected what he needed, a small bag of screws, sandpaper, and new paintbrush. I waited near the front, watching the light move slowly across the tiled floor. When he finished, we stepped back into the street, the bag in his hand swinging lightly with his stride. We stopped at a corner cafe for coffee to take away. The place was busier than I expected for a weekday morning, the air inside thick with the smell of roasted beans and warm pastries. We waited at the counter, standing close enough that I could hear the quiet sound of him clearing his throat before ordering. Outside again, the heat from the cup seeped into my palms, grounding me in the moment. We walked back together until our routes divided. At the corner, he shifted the bag of supplies to his other hand and glanced toward my street. "I'll see you around," he said, his voice even. I answered with a small nod, and we each turned toward home. Back at the apartment, I set my keys down and placed the coffee cup on the table, letting it sit while I checked the time. My husband's earlier call echoed faintly in my mind, the certainty of his return later that day shaping the edges of the hours I had left. I moved through small tasks, wiping the counters, folding a throw blanket, watering the plant on the windowsill. The coffee had cooled by the time I sat to drink it. I sipped it slowly, thinking about the morning's walk, the simple cadence of our steps, the easy exchange of words that didn't need to stretch beyond themselves. It was remarkable how ordinary moments could expand in memory, how they could hold more weight than their surface suggested. The afternoon passed quietly. I prepared dinner early, leaving it to rest on the stove. A light breeze slipped through the open window, carrying the faint scent of something baked from a nearby kitchen. I stood for a while just listening to the low hum of the building, distant footsteps, a door closing down the hall, the muffled rise and fall of a television in another apartment. When my husband returned earlier than I expected, the sound of his key in the lock was brisk, purposeful. He stepped inside, placing his bag by the door, and commented on the smell from the kitchen. We exchanged the brief outlines of our days. His meeting had gone well, my errands had been uneventful, and then settled into the evening's rhythm. Over dinner, conversation stayed light, touching on the weather, the upcoming weekend, a reminder about a bill that needed paying. Afterward, he moved to the living room to check emails while I cleared the dishes. The faint tapping of his fingers on the keyboard carried through the apartment, a steady, familiar sound. Later, in bed, I lay awake for a time, listening to the quiet breathing beside me. The room was dim except for the faint glow from the streetlight outside, and the shadows it cast were long and gentle across the ceiling. My mind wandered to the morning walk again, the easy company, the unhurried pace, the way the coffee cup had warmed my hands as we turned down the street. Some days, I realized, don't hinge on grand events. They turn instead on smaller moments, the kind that can pass without notice in the moment but settle deep afterward, shaping the way you move through the rest of the day. This had been one of those days. The morning came with a pale, steady light that made everything in the apartment appear flatter, as though the day had not yet decided how much life to give its colors. My husband left for the office earlier than usual, taking a travel mug of coffee with him and kissing me lightly on the forehead before stepping out. The click of the door was soft but final, and the quiet that followed seemed to expand into every room. I lingered over my own cup of coffee, sitting at the table longer than necessary, watching a thin plume of steam rise and twist into nothing. The day stretched ahead without fixed plans. I thought about starting the laundry or organizing the cupboard above the sink, but my mind kept drifting toward the image of Rowan in the yard, the faint scrape of gravel under familiar footsteps. By late morning, I stepped outside. The air was cool but not sharp, the kind of weather that makes you walk without urgency. I headed toward the park, telling myself it was only to enjoy the open space. The path curved ahead, and just beyond the first bend, I saw him. Rowan was trotting alongside, tail lifting slightly at the sight of me. He gave a small nod as I approached, and we fell into step without formal greeting. We walked along the path where the trees cast dappled shadows across the gravel. Our conversation was sparse, brief comments about the clear sky, the way the leaves were beginning to shift in color. The silences between words felt familiar now, not heavy but measured, each one an acknowledgement of shared presence. At the far side of the park, he mentioned needing to stop by the post office. Without much thought, I said I would walk with him. The route took us along a quieter street lined with small shops, most with their doors propped open to let in the mild air. At the post office, he disappeared inside while I stood near the window, watching Rowan settle at my feet. The sound of a stamp pressing down on paper reached faintly through the open door. When he returned, we didn't immediately turn back. Instead, we continued down the street until we reached a corner where a small bakery had set a few tables outside. He suggested we sit for a moment, and I agreed. We ordered tea, and while we waited, I noticed the way the late morning sun caught in the glass jars on the counter inside, turning their contents into muted shades of amber and gold. We spoke a little more here, the conversation circling around errands, weekend plans, the practical details of days. There was nothing in our words that would draw notice, yet the act of sitting there felt deliberate, an unspoken choice to let time slow. When we finished, we walked back toward the park, retracing our steps until we reached the gate. At the point where our paths normally divided, we paused. Rowan sat between us, glancing from one to the other as though waiting for a cue. He said, "I'll see you," his voice even, and I nodded. I turned toward my street, feeling the pull of the shared walk even as the distance between us grew with each step. Back at home, I moved through the rooms in a measured way. I folded laundry, straightened the cushions on the sofa, and answered a few short messages. The hours passed with the slow rhythm of a day without urgency, yet the morning remained close, replaying itself in small fragments, the slant of sunlight across the cafe table, the quiet of the side street, the weight of pauses that seemed to carry more than their length suggested. When my husband came home that evening, the routine resumed as it always did. We talked about his day over dinner, the conversation dipping briefly into news from his office before moving on to the usual exchange about bills and household tasks. He didn't seem to notice anything unusual, and I found myself responding with the same ease as always. After dinner, he settled in the living room with his laptop, the steady rhythm of typing filling the background. I tidied the kitchen, rinsing plates and stacking them in the dishwasher, each small sound sharp in the quiet. The windows reflected the interior light, making the room feel smaller, more contained. Later, lying in bed, I could still picture the path in the park, the way Rowan's leash had looped loosely in his hand, the faint scent of fresh bread drifting from the bakery. These were ordinary details, yet they lingered, holding their shape in the dim space between waking and sleep. Some days leave no single defining moment, only a collection of small ones that, together, press more firmly into memory than anything louder could. This had been such a day. The day began with the kind of light that makes everything seem sharper, as though the edges of objects had been redrawn overnight. My husband left for work at his usual time, the morning routine unfolding with the quiet efficiency it always had. The sound of the door closing behind him felt ordinary, yet it left a stillness that seemed to hum faintly in the background. I moved through the first hours without direction, tidying the kitchen, refolding a stack of towels, checking the plants on the windowsill. The air was cool but dry, the sort that encourages you to step outside even without a purpose. By late morning, I found myself walking toward the park, the decision made so naturally it felt less like a choice and more like the continuation of a pattern. The path was quiet, the crunch of gravel under my shoes the only consistent sound. As I rounded the bend, I saw him. Rowan was a few paces ahead, nose to the ground, and lifted his head when I approached. He gave a small wave, and I returned it. There was no surprise in the meeting, only a quiet acknowledgement. We walked together, the pace unhurried. Conversation began with the weather, how the clear air felt like a sign that autumn was setting in properly, and moved to the ordinary details of the week. There was an ease in the way our words filled only part of the space between us, leaving the rest to the sound of our steps and Rowan's light panting. At the far side of the park, we paused near the bench where we had sat weeks ago. Neither of us suggested sitting this time, instead, we stood looking out across the open grass. A few leaves, turned yellow at the edges, shifted in the breeze before falling. He mentioned he had an errand to run near the station, and without much thought, I said I'd walk with him. The streets toward the station were busier, the hum of traffic and the occasional burst of voices from shopfronts breaking the quiet we'd carried from the park. We navigated through it easily, pausing at crosswalks, stepping aside for others, the small choreography of moving together without discussion. At the station, he stopped at a small kiosk to collect a package. I waited just outside, watching people hurry past, their movements full of purpose. When he returned, we stood for a moment in the flow of foot traffic before turning away from the busiest streets, choosing a quieter route back. As we neared the point where our paths would divide, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I took it out and saw my husband's name on the screen. The message was short: I still love you. I stopped walking. The noise of the street seemed to dull around me, the words on the screen holding all my attention. My breath caught, though not in shock, more in the weight of something unexpected pressing into the moment. He noticed my pause and looked at me, his expression questioning but not intrusive. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, unsure whether to respond immediately or at all. The message sat in my mind like an object placed carefully on a shelf, waiting to be examined from all sides. We stood there for a beat longer, the quiet between us deepening. Finally, I said I should get home. He nodded, and we exchanged a brief farewell before turning in opposite directions. The walk back to my street felt longer than usual, each step marked by the pulse of those 4 words echoing in my head. At home, I set my keys down and stood in the center of the living room, letting the stillness settle. I made tea but forgot to drink it until it had cooled. My thoughts moved in slow circles, touching on the message, the morning walk, the weeks that had led here. There was no single conclusion to draw, only the awareness that something had shifted, though in which direction I could not yet tell. When my husband came home that evening, his manner was as it always was, warm but contained, the conversation moving easily over the surface of the day. I responded in kind, though the message lingered between us, unspoken but present. Later, in bed, I lay awake long after the lights were out. The quiet of the room pressed close, broken only by the sound of his steady breathing. I turned the words over in my mind again, feeling their weight but not yet their shape. Some truths arrive not as revelations, but as reminders, and it is only in the days that follow that you begin to understand what they are asking of you.